Romans chapter 13. We're going to be looking at putting on the armor of light. Clicker back there, Lane. Is it back there? Oh, here it is. I'm just blind. And there's two parts to this into chapter 13. The first 7 verses is talking about grace and within the government. And I'll be honest with you, I'm going to read some stuff to you today. Okay, I don't like to do that a lot. But these 7 verses are just a little above my pay grade. As far as me trying to, I guess, get in and really explain exactly kind of what's going on. So the book, as I was studying this, the book does a pretty good job at explaining things. So I'm going to read a little bit of stuff to you. Again, I don't like to do that a lot, but I want to accurately give you kind of what these 7 verses are talking about. And as I was studying this week, a couple times I was like, this is just a little, I don't know exactly what's going on here. So I will be doing some of that to start off with. And it's not overly complicated. It's just the way they describe it, I think, is better than the way that I could describe it, if that makes sense. So I'll be reading some stuff to you for those first couple things. And then the last part of this is called timely motivation. And it talks about living each day. And that's kind of the back part of this. And it's putting on the armor of light is what this is, as you can see, is what this is titled. And there's 2 ways to start off with here that Paul kind of mentions that putting on the armor of light and what exactly that means. And at the end of this chapter, he actually kind of comes back to this point to describe some really important instructions that help, like the rest of the chapter, kind of make sense. And it kind of puts things into perspective for us. If you look at verse 12 of chapter 13, so if we go to the end of this chapter, it kind of puts the rest of these verses in perspective for us. So if you jump over to to verse 12, and we're going to look at verse 14 as well. He uses 2 commands here, or gives us 2 statements that are, both of these in verses 12 and 14, they're pretty much saying the same thing. He's just saying them in different ways. And he's just telling us that we need to be putting on this armor of light. Let's look at verse 12 first. And it says that the night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Look down at verse 14 as well, of the same chapter. But put ye, on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. So we see 2 instances, which is kind of telling us the same thing, just telling us in different ways, is when we as Christians are putting on the armor of light. What that means is that everybody around us should see Christ in our lives. Okay, so when he says, putting on the armor of light, putting on Christ, the description is that regardless of the situation, no matter who's around us, people should be able to see Christ in us. This a very essential command and instruction that he is giving us, because it's telling us how to live our lives daily. Right? We should be living our lives daily so that the people around us can see Christ in us. All right? And that puts the rest of this chapter in perspective. So we're going to go back to verse 1 here. We're going to keep in mind what Paul tells us at the end of this chapter of making sure that we're putting on this armor of light. Paul goes on farther to instruct the Roman believers, even kind of a step farther, by saying not just putting on the armor of light around the people that you work with and that you interact with, but you should also be putting on Christ, or putting on this armor of light even with the government and people who are in charge of you. Okay? Now, why would that have been a big deal for Paul to tell the Romans that during the time that he's writing? That they should be acting or putting on the armor of light even in the midst of the Roman government. What was going on to Christians during this time? They were being persecuted, right? And they were burning them at the stake and using their bodies as lamps to night, and they're doing a lot of stuff to the Christians. And Paul's telling the Christians now, even in the midst of all of that, right? Make sure you are still putting on and being clothed in the armor of light. So let's go back to verse 1 here of chapter 13, and we talk about grace in the government and origin and the authority of civil government, and how even in the midst of this, these Christians should be making sure they're portraying Christ all the time. Okay? So verse 1 of chapter 13 says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." So Paul starts this chapter by saying every Christian, matter of fact, he goes as far as says every soul, right, is to live in subjection of the government that is over them. Okay? Again, we got to remember the context here, the time period that Paul's talking to, that he's telling these Christians to make sure they're living in subjection to the government. Now, this passage, right, as we go through these 7 verses, what we're going to notice is that there are no exceptions. Right? Paul is pretty straightforward here. There are no exceptions. And as at the time Paul was writing this, as he's writing this letter, the Christians that he was writing to, and even he himself, were living under the control of Emperor Nero. Okay? And we know we've heard that name Nero before, right? He was the Roman emperor that eventually persecuted the Christians and began this murderous campaign, essentially trying to expel all of the Christians from within the Roman Empire. So Paul's telling these people that they should be no exceptions here. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The power that be ordained are of God. Let's jump over to 1 Peter real quick and kind of see this same thing. Go to 1 Peter chapter 2. And look at verses 13 down through verse 17. 1 Peter 2, 13 to 17. Peter kind of mentions the same idea here. Starting in verse 13. "Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as a servant of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king." So we see kind of some of the same commandments here, the same statements here as well that Peter's saying. How did he express the seriousness of this command to submit yourself to government? How serious did Peter? How serious was his command here to submit to the government? Pretty serious, right? He actually says that in doing so, it is the will of God, right? It is the will of God to make sure you're living under the government. So, if anyone was able to make a case for not following the wicked government leader, it could have been Paul. Right? Paul was the guy that could have said, all right, Nero's persecuting Christians, he's doing stuff that's wrong. He could have made a case, realistically, for not following under the rule of the government. But he didn't. Nero was murderous, he was adulterous, he was a neglectful leader who persecuted the Christians mercilessly. And he did it for as long as he possibly could. But even with that, Paul still states the position of submitting to governmental authority. All right. He goes on to explain the reasons here. Still in verse 1. "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God." But those powers are what? What's it say at the end of verse 1? They're ordained of God, right? They're ordained of God. So the powers that be, the government, has been ordained of God. Now, Paul is referring primarily to the authorities that were in control at the time. But this same statement can be applied to any age. Okay? God establishes kings. God thrones them. No official holds his or her place except by God's will. Okay? No official holds his or her place except by God's will. We go to Daniel 2:20. See that? Daniel 2:21, Daniel 4:17, John 19:11. All in instances when those things are going on. We can see again God's will being taken place because of the officials that hold power. Now, since the government authorities, since it comes from God, all right, we can establish that government authority comes from God. To defy that authority means we are defying God. Okay, are you with me? Since the government authority is ordained from God, for us to defy that authority means that we are defying God. Okay, and then defying the one who then, of course, brings judgment. All right. Now, it may be the authorities who administer the punishment for defying the authority, but it ultimately and essentially comes from God. So what are some ways, that believers might disrespect or resist the authority of their government? What are some ways that believers might disrespect or resist the authority of their government? Okay, what are some ways that we can do that? What are some of the things that we as believers could do to kind of defy it? Cheat on income taxes. It's a good one. Cheat on our taxes. Being dishonest on our taxes. Not obeying the law. Right? That's a way. It's a simple way of doing it. That's been placed. Speaking disparagingly about or of the government officials. Or ways in which we could be disrespectful. So those are all things and ways believers can be disrespectful. And we as Christians need to remember, even if we don't like it, right? Even if we don't like it, we have to remember that it's still under the authority of God, right? There's still a reason that it's there, okay? And it doesn't give us, just because we don't like or agree with everything, doesn't give us the right to be able to outwardly defy it, okay? What Paul is trying to get to. Now, so we've got the origin. This government is set up because of God. God ordained it. Okay, so therefore we should have to obey it. We also have verses 3 through 5. We have the purpose of civil government. So we see the authority. We also see the purpose of it. So let's read verses 3, 4, and 5 of chapter 13. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have the praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. Paul goes on. Verses 3, 4, and 5. Since the government now has been ordained of God, Paul then calls the leaders of the government ministers of God. I was see it in verse 4. For he is the minister of God. So the leader of the government is a minister of God. Now, the word minister that's used is usually a general sense as a servant to others. Okay, that's the phrasing there that's used. This is servant to others. The word could be translated into servant. The word minister there could be translated over into servant. Knowingly or unknowingly, government leaders are serving the plan of God. Now, we don't have time this morning, but we can go to Ezra chapter 1. We can see this. We can go to Isaiah 41 and see this. We can go to Isaiah 46 and see this as well. Either knowingly or unknowingly, the people in charge are carrying out God's will. Okay? Are carrying out, serving, and seeing God's plan. Now, even the godless leaders today, those are appointed by God and are there to serve God's purpose. Okay? In Romans 13:3, Paul makes this general statement here that rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Right? Verse 3 says, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same." So Paul making the general statement again, rulers are not a terror of good works, but to evil. Now it does not always work out that way, but it is the purpose of God in establishing human government. Even in the cases when government have persecuted Christians, it has often been because the leaders believe that Christians threaten the peace and the safety of the land. For the most part, a true government puts down crime. Now, obviously, the way to avoid being fearful of civil authorities, being fearful of the government, is to make sure that you're doing the right thing, right? If you don't want the government to come down on you or civil authorities to come down on you, make sure that you're doing the right things. In other words, obey the law. Right? When a police officer tells you to stop, you stop. Right? When he tells you not to do something, you don't do it. You obey the law to make sure you don't have to worry about a fear of the civil authority. Those who obey the law are going to have praise. Right? We'll go back to verse 3, the end of that. After he asks the question, "Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power?" it says, "Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same." So if you don't want to get in trouble with the law, obviously obey the law, right? Obey the government, obey what the laws that are there. Now, the word does not mean here public awards and civil honors, okay? Except for the rare instances and the rare cases that happens. But the word does, though, it carries the thought of approval. The word carries a thought of approval. Good behavior gains good standing in the state. Something to be, as Christians, we should be desiring to maintain good standing within the government, within the local authorities, and it should be desired to be maintained. Now, if a church was known for always butting heads with the local government, okay, if a church was known for always butting the heads of local government, what effect could that church have on the ministry opportunities in the neighborhood? The church was always known for butting heads with local authorities. How is that going to affect the community it's trying to affect for Christ? It's not going to work, right? A bunch of rebellious Christians down there who don't want to do anything the law says, think they're living above it. It's not going to be a very effective testimony. Same thing in the lives as Christians, right? If we are known as people constantly breaking the law or constantly just butting heads with the government, again, they're going to see that we're just rebellious people who don't want to listen to the law, think they're above the law, whatever it may be. And that's going to cause a problem. A church that fights local government, whenever it gets the chance, will have trouble communicating the love of Christ in a believable manner. Christians who are always butting heads with local authorities and trying to fight things like that will again have trouble communicating the love in a believable manner. All right? The message of the gospel will be outshadowed by the lack of love the church is showing to the government. All right? So, to verse 4 now of chapter 13. In its function of suppressing other evildoers or other criminals or lawbreakers, the civil authority bears the sword. Right? So let's go to verse 4. For he is the minister of God to thee that do good, to thee for good. But if thou that do which is evil be afraid, for he that beareth not the sword in vain, for he is a minister of God, to revenge to execute the wrath upon him that doeth evil. This statement here, talking about him having the sword, refers to an actual sword that the Greek magistrates probably would carry it around. Or it could have been the same kind of the executioner's sword who was kind of had some beheadings. That sword was a symbol of justice, right? Was a symbol of penalty for breaking the law. The state is a revenger to execute the wrath upon him that doeth evil, as it says in verse 4. It is the state, the government, it is the agent of God to carry out justice. All right? Some people understand Romans 12, 19, and 20. And let's look at those real quick. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourself, but rather give place unto the wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. All right, so some people understand Romans 12, 19, and 20 to say that the state should not take life and that the government should not go to war since God has declared vengeance is his. Okay, and true, all right, it is, but chapter 13 clearly states and teaches us that in the case of crimes, in the case of law breaking, God has ordained the government to be his instrument in carrying out the vengeance and the penalties for the crime. The believer is not to avenge himself in personal wrongs, but verse 4 is talking about wrongs against or crimes taking place against society, against the populace. All right? We'll go to verse 5. Paul then in verse 5 brings out that believers should be submitting to the law and obeying it to avoid the wrath of the government or avoid the wrath of the civil authorities. Look at verse 5, chapter 13. Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. Okay? So, believers also need to be submitting to the law and obeying it to avoid the wrath of the government. Which happens to be the reason, right? The wrath of the government is the reason why people obey the law. Okay? Because we don't want our tickets, don't want to go to jail, don't want to do all the different things that happens, right? So believers is to obey the law for conscience sake. Even if there were no penalties, okay, for breaking the law, the Christian should still obey the law just because obedience is the morally right thing to do. So just because even if there wasn't a consequence for breaking the speed limit or doing whatever, okay, Christians should still, just because it's a moral obligation of us, to be making sure we're maintaining the law. We should obey the law out of the sense of an obligation for God. 1 Peter 2:13 again says, submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. The truest test of our obedience, to the government is how we respond to the laws, okay, when the police aren't around. Right? The truest test of obedience to government is how we respond to the laws when no one is around to police our actions. Very simple example of this, right? Driving down the interstate says 60, Lance is doing 67. As soon as he sees the police, what does Lance do? Hits the brakes, right? In reality, now it's simple, right? And we kind of can giggle about it and smile. But in reality, what should Lance have been doing the whole time? The speed limit, right? The speed limit. I got pulled over the other day, okay, for doing 35 and a 25. And I didn't even see the cop over there. And I was a little irritated that he pulled me over. That's beside the point. So he pulls up on me, and he pulls me over, and I don't have my seatbelt on. Okay, I don't wear it. I never have. I know that I should. I just don't wear it. All right. So he comes up. Do you know why I pulled you over? And me, well, no. If I would have known that, then I wouldn't let you pull me over. Right? I would have seen that. So he's like, well, you're doing 35 and a 25. And I said, well, I apologize. I'm sure that I was. So he took my license, did the whole rigmarole. And he comes back and he says, I'm not going to give you a ticket because, you're just doing 35 and 25. Just make sure you kind of slow it down next time through here. But I am going to have to write you for not wearing your seatbelt because, it's a law not to wear your seatbelt. And he asked me, he's like, why don't you have your seatbelt on? And I just was honest with him. I said, sir, I never wear my seatbelt. I just never put it on. And he said, well, that's not a smart thing to do because I appreciate you being honest with me. Because of that, I'll just write you for the seatbelt ticket and off with the thing. Now, I was upset about it, right? Didn't like it. Made me mad. Irritated. Got to go to court now. Write the check out. All the stuff I have to do. But, again, if I had just been following the law, right, none of these things would have happened. Even though that the one occasional time that I see that cop come through town, all right, a lot of times if I pull up on a road check, first thing I do is snap that seatbelt on real quick when it should be on all the time because that is the law, right? So it should be obedience even when the people aren't policing. It should be my moral obligation, it should be our moral obligation as Christians to make sure we are still obeying the law, even when there's a little chance for us to get caught, okay? There's what happened to me this week. Verse 6 and 7. We see the last part of this grace in the government, and that is the recognition of civil government. And again, we see this in verses 6 and 7. And Paul, again in verse 6, is going to repeat the idea that the governmental authorities are his ministers. All right, verse 6. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom, and fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. All right, so again, Paul is referring to the authorities as God's ministers. However, this word that he uses here is different from the one that he uses in verse 4. The word that he uses here is the same as the priest in the temple in their temple ministry. So civil rulers are ministers of God's service. The very thing of verse 6 here. Right? So let's look at verse 6 for a second. And it says, "For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing." The two words there, very thing, in verse 6, what it refers to are taxes. Okay? And then continually, right, it says verse 6, right? Let's go back one more time. "For this cause pay ye the tribute also, for they are God's ministers," the authority. All right, and it says, attending continually upon this very thing. So, continually, Paul's talking about paying the taxes here. All right, doesn't need any explanation. Regularly and swiftly, the deadline for tax payments, it's going to come every year, right? It's going to happen every year. And we're supposed to be making sure that we're following the law. This is the instance here of taxpayers. We could apply this same thing to any law. All right, verse 7. And when we read verse 7, I want you to just find me where the exception is. Okay, verse 7. "Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." Where is the exception? There's not one, right? There is no exception here. There's no exceptions made in this verse. Verse 7 here is summarizing or itemizing the subjects here. Render to all their dues. Right? That is, discharge your obligations in relation to the state and civil authorities. The settlement involves the tribute to whom tribute is due. That's income taxes, personal taxes, property taxes, all of them. Make sure they're all being paid. Custom to whom custom. That corresponds to our payments on goods. Sales taxes, customs payments. Fear to whom fear. Expresses the feelings that we should have towards our highest officials. We should have veneration. We should have respect. Honor to whom honor. Much the same meaning. Make sure we're honoring the people who are in charge. This indicates certainly a respect, a due respect for all governmental authorities. Okay. Last thing, we'll finish with this. So, with this, let's summarize what should characterize our actions and attitudes as we as Christians put on the armor of light in relation to our government. So what are some of the things that we should be doing in relation to our government that shows that we have on the armor of light? The first one I have here is obey the laws of the government. Right, that even means putting my seatbelt on when I don't want to. Okay? Obey the laws of the government. I shouldn't have said that because now this whole week Haley's going to be on here. Put that seatbelt on. Practice what you preach on Sunday. I'll hear that all week. Submit the governmental leaders. All right, make sure we're submitting to governmental leaders. Pay taxes as required. Honor governmental leaders, even if we don't agree with all the things they're standing with. Okay? Even if we don't agree with all their stances, and we're not going to. Right? We as Christians morally shouldn't. We should have a problem with some of the stuff that our government officials stand for. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't honor the position. Okay? Because God has them there for a reason. Seek a good standing with the government as well. So that is how we as Christians can be putting on and recognizing the armor, all the armor of light with the government that is around us. Next week we'll get into timely motivation, and we'll finish up this chapter, knowing the time, living each day, loving others, and we kind of move an obligation here to submitting to authority, but in light of us submitting to authority, never losing sight of our actual home in heaven. Okay, and that's the transition we make next week. Okay, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lesson that we had here, for the fact, Lord, you're able to take, Paul is able to take a couple of verses here and be able to describe the importance of us essentially being good earthly citizens, right? Making sure that we're following the laws, paying our taxes, obeying the things, doing what we're supposed to do to be good citizens, Lord, and how that is an effect. It shows the people around us how also what it means for us to be Christians. Christians who are breaking the law all the time and doing things shouldn't be doing, not paying taxes, and all the stuff that's going on, don't have a very good standing relationship with the people around them, so they can't be effective in their testimony. And that's the reason Paul puts this in here, Lord, so that even during the time that we thank you for that it's in here, even during this time of these writing this, all the persecution is going on, we still see the importance of living life as we should be living life as Christians, Lord. So I pray, Lord, that is a constant reminder to us. That's in constantly in our mind throughout this week, Lord, that we are making sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, to putting on the armor of light, Lord, in all situations around. Lord, I pray for Pastor Rob as he comes in the next hour as well, that you'll just use him, Lord, in a mighty way. Keep us attentive, not just to you, not just with our ears, Lord, but with our hearts, Lord, being able to take and apply to our lives the lesson, the truths that we hear. And here I pray.